On a cold February morning in 1901, in a mahogany-paneled office at 23 Wall Street in Manhattan, a single handshake between two of the most powerful men in American history created something the world had never seen before: the first billion-dollar corporation. John Pierpont Morgan, the titan of American finance, whose very gaze was said to be capable of collapsing banks and building empires, extended his hand to Andrew Carnegie's personal emissary, and in that moment, the United States Steel Corporation was born. The price tag was staggering beyond comprehension: $1.4 billion, a sum so vast that it represented more than the entire annual budget of the United States federal government. With the stroke of a pen and the transfer of stock certificates, J.P. Morgan had assembled a corporate colossus that would control nearly 70% of America's steel production, employ hundreds of thousands of workers, and reshape the industrial landscape of an entire nation. But behind the glittering numbers and the triumphant headlines lay a far darker reality: a story of crushed labor movements, company towns where workers lived and died at the pleasure of distant corporate masters, environmental devastation that poisoned rivers and blackened skies, and communities that would be built up and then abandoned when the profits ran dry. This is not merely a story about the creation of a company. This is a story about the forging of modern America itself, about the chains of industrial capitalism that bound workers to furnaces where temperatures exceeded 2,000 degrees, where 12-hour shifts and 7-day weeks were standard, where men died in accidents that were considered simply the cost of doing business. This is the story of towns like Homestead, Pennsylvania, where one of the bloodiest labor confrontations in American history left workers dead in the streets while Pinkerton agents fired into crowds of strikers. This is the story of Gary, Indiana, a city literally conjured from sand dunes by corporate decree, designed from its very foundations to serve the steel mills that would become both its lifeblood and its curse. And this is the story of how a monopoly built on the promise of efficiency and progress ultimately left behind a trail of broken communities, polluted landscapes, shining generations of workers whose bodies were consumed by the very industry that was supposed to lift them into prosperity. Welcome to Coded Dark Wealth. If you find yourself drawn to the hidden histories behind America's greatest industrial fortunes, if you want to understand how the steel that built our skyscrapers, our bridges, our railroads, and our weapons was forged not just in blast furnaces, but in the suffering of working people, then you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because the story we are about to unfold reveals the true cost of industrial progress, the human lives traded for corporate profits, and the lessons that remain devastatingly relevant as we continue to grapple with the legacy of unchecked corporate power in our own time. To understand how the United States Steel Corporation came to dominate American industry with such totality, we must first travel back to the decades before its creation, to the years when steel itself was transforming from a luxury material into the fundamental building block of modern civilization. For most of human history, steel had been precious and rare, produced in small quantities through laborious processes that made it suitable for swords and tools, but impractical for large-scale construction. The transformation began in 1856, when an English inventor named Henry Bessemer patented a revolutionary process for producing steel by blowing air through molten pig iron, removing impurities, and allowing the mass production of high-quality steel at a fraction of the previous cost. The Bessemer process, and then later the Siemens-Martin open hearth process, turned steel from an artisanal product into an industrial commodity, and the race to exploit this new capability would reshape the economic geography of the United States. The man who would come to dominate this new industry more completely than any other was not born to wealth or privilege. Andrew Carnegie arrived in the United States in 1848 as a 13-year-old Scottish immigrant, his family fleeing the economic devastation that had destroyed his father's hand-loom weaving business. They settled in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, and young Andrew went to work immediately, first as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill, earning $1.20 per week, then as a telegraph messenger, and eventually as a telegraph operator whose skill and intelligence caught the attention of Thomas A. Scott, a rising executive at the Pennsylvania Railroad. Scott became Carnegie's mentor introducing him to the world of railroads, finance, and industrial capitalism that would define his future. Carnegie learned the art of investment, the importance of vertical integration, and the ruthless logic of competition that rewarded those who could produce goods more cheaply and efficiently than their rivals. By the 1870s, Andrew Carnegie had recognized that the future of American industry lay in steel. Railroads needed steel rails to replace the iron rails that wore out too quickly under the weight of heavy traffic. Bridges needed steel girders to span distances that iron could not support. And buildings were beginning to reach skyward, their skeletal frames requiring the strength that only steel could provide. Carnegie entered the steel business with characteristic aggression, building the Edgar Thomson Steel Works near Pittsburgh in 1875 and naming it after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, his most important potential customer. From the beginning, Carnegie applied the principles of vertical integration and cost reduction that would make him the master of American steel. He acquired iron ore mines in Minnesota's Mesabi Range, limestone quarries, coal fields, and railroad lines to transport raw materials to his mills. He hired chemists and engineers to improve production processes, and he drove down labor costs with a ferocity that would make him one of the most hated employers in American industry. The Carnegie Steel Company grew relentlessly throughout the 1880s and 90s, absorbing competitors, expanding capacity, and dominating the American steel market with a combination of superior efficiency and ruthless business practices. Carnegie himself cultivated a public image as a benevolent capitalist, writing essays about the gospel of wealth and promising to devote his fortune to philanthropic causes. But the workers in his mills experienced a very different reality. Working conditions in Carnegie's steel plants were extraordinarily dangerous and demanding. Men labored in temperatures that could exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit, tending furnaces that could explode without warning, handling molten metal that could burn flesh to the bone in an instant. The standard work schedule was 12 hours per day, 7 days per week, with workers alternating between day and night shifts in a grueling pattern that left them perpetually exhausted. Wages were tied to production quotas that incentivized speed over safety, and the company fought relentlessly against any attempt by workers to organize and demand better conditions. The tensions between Carnegie Steel and its workers exploded into open warfare in 1892, in an event that would become one of the defining confrontations of the American labor movement. The Homestead Strike began in June of that year, when the contract between the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers and the Carnegie Steel Company expired without renewal. Henry Clay Frick, Carnegie's ruthless lieutenant who managed the company's operations, while Carnegie himself was conveniently vacationing in Scotland, had been preparing for this confrontation for months. He was determined to break the union and establish absolute corporate control over the Homestead Works, and he had no intention of negotiating in good faith. When the workers rejected his demand for substantial wage cuts, Frick locked them out of the plant and prepared to bring in replacement workers under armed guard. What happened next shocked the nation. Frick had contracted with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to provide 300 armed guards who would escort strikebreakers into the Homestead plant and defend it against the locked-out workers. In the early morning hours of July 6, 1892, two barges carrying the Pinkerton agents attempted to land at the Homestead Works on the banks of the Monongahela River. The workers and their families were waiting for them. Someone fired the first shot, and then chaos erupted. For the next 14 hours, a pitched battle raged along the riverbank, with workers firing rifles and even a small cannon at the Pinkerton barges, while the agents returned fire from behind steel barriers. By the time the Pinkertons finally surrendered, 10 men lay dead, 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons, and dozens more were wounded. The surrendering agents were forced to run a gauntlet of enraged workers and townspeople who beat them with fists, clubs, and umbrellas as they made their way to temporary imprisonment in the local opera house. The violence at Homestead did not end the conflict, for it merely escalated the stakes. The governor of Pennsylvania, Robert Pattison, called out the state militia, and 8,000 soldiers occupied Homestead, effectively placing the town under martial law. With military protection, Frick was able to bring in replacement workers and restart production. The Union held out for months, But without access to the plant and facing criminal charges related to the July violence, their position became increasingly desperate. By November of 1892, the strike was broken. The Amalgamated Association was crushed at Homestead, and its defeat sent a chilling message to workers throughout the steel industry. The corporations had the power to call upon the state itself to enforce their will. Carnegie's public reputation was damaged by the violence, but his profits continued to soar. The crushing of the Homestead Union allowed the company to impose longer hours and lower wages, and the absence of organized resistance enabled conditions that would have been intolerable to workers with collective bargaining power. Andrew Carnegie, for all his public hand-wringing about the violence at Homestead, never truly held Frick accountable for what had happened. He expressed private regret, but took no action to restore the Union or improve conditions for his workers. The message was clear: efficiency and profit took precedence over human welfare, and any worker who challenged corporate authority would face the full weight of industrial and governmental power. This was the culture, the philosophy, and the system that would be inherited by the United States Steel Corporation when it absorbed Carnegie Steel in 1901. The patterns established in the Carnegie years, the long hours, the dangerous conditions, the hostility to organized labor, the company towns where corporations controlled every aspect of workers' lives, would continue and even intensify under the new corporate giant. By the end of the 1890s, the American steel industry had become a battlefield of competing giants, with Carnegie Steel as the dominant but not unchallenged force. Federal Steel, organized by J.P. Morgan in 1898 under the leadership of Elbert Gary, controlled significant production capacity and was expanding aggressively. National Steel, American Steel and Wire, American Tin Plate, and numerous other companies competed for market share in an increasingly chaotic environment. The competition drove down prices, threatened profit margins, and created the instability that J.P. Morgan found intolerable. Morgan believed in what he called community of interest, a philosophy that held that destructive competition should be replaced by cooperative arrangements among major producers. In practice, this meant consolidation, the creation of massive corporations that could control prices, eliminate redundant capacity, and impose order on turbulent markets. The catalyst for the creation of United States Steel came from an unexpected source. In December of 1900, Charles M. Schwab, the brilliant young president of Carnegie Steel, gave an after-dinner speech at the University Club in New York that would change the course of American industrial history. When Schwab outlined a vision of a consolidated steel industry that would combine all the major producers into a single vertically integrated corporation, eliminating the waste of competition and creating unprecedented economies of scale. J.P. Morgan was in the audience, and he was captivated. After the speech, Morgan pulled Schwab aside and asked if such a consolidation was actually possible. Schwab assured him that it was, and the two men began secret discussions that would continue for weeks. The key obstacle to Morgan's consolidation plan was Andrew Carnegie himself. Carnegie was 65 years old in 1900, and he had been contemplating retirement for years, expressing a desire to devote his remaining life to philanthropy. But he was also a fierce competitor who enjoyed the game of business. Watson, there was no guarantee that he would agree to sell. Morgan dispatched Schwab to approach Carnegie on the golf course, where the elderly Scotsman was more relaxed and amenable to discussion. Schwab outlined Morgan's proposal and asked Carnegie to name his price. Carnegie took a pencil and wrote a number on a piece of paper: $480 million. When Schwab delivered this figure to Morgan, the financier glanced at it and said simply, "I accept." There was no negotiation, no counteroffer, no extended haggling. Morgan understood that this was the price of removing the most formidable competitor from the field, and he was willing to pay it. The formation of the United States Steel Corporation was announced in February of 1901, and the scale of the enterprise astonished the world. The new company combined Carnegie Steel, Federal Steel, National Steel, American Steel and Wire, American Tin Plate, American Steel Hoop, American Sheet Steel, American Bridge, Shelby Steel Tube, Lake Superior Consolidated Iron Mines, and numerous other enterprises into a single corporate entity. Its total capitalization was $1.4 billion, a figure that represented roughly 7% of the entire gross national product of the United States at the time. The corporation controlled approximately two-thirds of American steel production, owned over 1,000 miles of railroad track, operated a fleet of more than 100 ore boats on the Great Lakes, and employed more than 168,000 workers. It was, quite simply, the largest business enterprise the world had ever seen. The man J.P. Morgan chose to lead this industrial colossus was not the charismatic Charles Schwab, whose personal indiscretions made him unsuitable for public leadership in Morgan's eyes, but the more sober and respectable Elbert H. Gary. Gary was a corporate lawyer from Illinois who had organized Federal Steel for Morgan and demonstrated the kind of careful, methodical management style that the financier valued. He became chairman of the board of United States Steel, a position he would hold for more than a quarter century, and he set about imposing his vision of corporate order on the sprawling enterprise. Gary was a complex figure, a devout Methodist who opposed drinking and gambling, but saw no contradiction in presiding over an industry that maimed and killed workers at an alarming rate. He believed in what he called fair competition, which in practice meant price-fixing arrangements with competitors that eliminated the unpredictability of free markets. And he was determined to prevent the unionization of the steel industry, viewing organized labor as an existential threat to corporate control. Under Gary's leadership, United States Steel consolidated its position as the dominant force in American industry. The corporation used its massive size to achieve economies of scale that smaller competitors could not match. It controlled the raw materials, iron ore, coal, limestone, that were essential to steel production, and it could manipulate access to these resources to disadvantage rivals. It owned the transportation infrastructure, railroads, ore boats, port facilities that moved these materials from mines to mills. And it employed a workforce so large that its labor policies effectively set the standard for the entire industry. When U.S. Steel maintained the 12-hour day and the 7-day week, other steel companies felt justified in doing the same. When U.S. Steel crushed organizing efforts, other companies took comfort in the knowledge that they could do likewise. But the creation of U.S. Steel also provoked a powerful backlash that would reshape American politics and law. The trust-busting movement, which had been building throughout the 1890s, found in U.S. Steel the perfect symbol of everything that was wrong with unchecked corporate power. Progressive reformers, muckraking journalists, and reform-minded politicians argued that corporations of this size posed a fundamental threat to democracy, that they could buy politicians and manipulate markets and crush workers with impunity. President Theodore Roosevelt, who took office in September of 1901 following the assassination of William McKinley, made trust-busting a central element of his domestic policy, though his relationship with U.S. Steel would prove more complicated than his rhetoric suggested. The true nature of United States Steel's power over American workers could be seen most clearly not in the boardrooms of Manhattan or the blast furnaces of Pittsburgh, but in the company towns that spread across the industrial heartland like a network of private fiefdoms. These were communities built, owned, and controlled entirely by the corporation, places where the company was not merely the employer, but the landlord, the merchant, the police force, and the government. Workers in these towns lived in company-owned houses, purchased their food and supplies at company-owned stores, sent their children to company-built schools, and worshipped in company-constructed churches. They were paid in company scrip that could only be redeemed at company establishments, and effectively trapping them in a closed economic system from which escape was nearly impossible. The company town was not unique to the steel industry, but U.S. Steel perfected the model on a scale that had never been seen before, creating dozens of communities across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Alabama, where hundreds of thousands of workers and their families lived under conditions that critics compared to feudalism or even slavery. The most ambitious and carefully planned of all U.S. Steel's company towns was Gary, Indiana, a city that did not exist before the corporation decided to build it. In 1905, the corporation's leadership determined that they needed a massive new production facility to meet growing demand for steel, and they chose a location on the southern shore of Lake Michigan, or approximately 25 miles southeast of Chicago, where empty sand dunes met the waters of the Great Inland Sea. The site offered deep water access for ore boats, proximity to railroad lines, abundant land for expansion, and something equally important: no existing community with established institutions, unions, or political traditions that might complicate corporate control. Elbert Gary, the chairman of U.S. Steel, lent his name to this new city, and the corporation set about creating an entire urban environment from scratch, designed from the ground up to serve the needs of steel production. The construction of Gary, Indiana, was one of the most remarkable feats of industrial engineering in American history. Beginning in 1906, thousands of workers descended on the empty dunes, building not just a steel mill, but an entire city to house the workforce that would operate it. The Gary Works, as the mill complex came to be known, would eventually stretch for 7 miles along the Lake Michigan shoreline, encompassing blast furnaces, open hearth furnaces, rolling mills, and finishing facilities that could produce millions of tons of steel annually. Around this industrial core, the corporation constructed a grid of residential streets lined with company-owned houses, graded by size and quality according to the rank and ethnicity of the workers who would occupy them. Skilled American-born workers received the largest and best-appointed homes, while immigrant laborers from Southern and Eastern Europe were housed in smaller, more crowded dwellings, closer to the noise and pollution of the mills. The racial and ethnic hierarchies of early 20th century America were literally built into the geography of the city. The corporation maintained control over Gary through multiple mechanisms. The Gary Land Company, a U.S. Steel subsidiary, owned virtually all the land in the city and could evict any tenant at will. The Indiana Steel Company, another subsidiary, operated the mills and could terminate any worker without cause or appeal. The company controlled the police force, influenced the courts, and dominated local politics through a combination of economic pressure and strategic philanthropy. Workers who complained about conditions, who attempted to organize unions, or who otherwise displeased the corporation could find themselves not only unemployed, but homeless, while blacklisted from employment throughout the industry and expelled from the only community they knew. The freedom that American workers theoretically enjoyed in a democratic society was effectively nullified within the boundaries of Gary, Indiana, where the corporation exercised a degree of control over daily life that would have been illegal if imposed by the government. The working conditions inside U.S. Steel's mills remained extraordinarily dangerous and demanding throughout the early decades of the 20th century. The 12-hour day that had been standard in the Carnegie era continued under U.S. Steel, with workers typically laboring 6 days per week and sometimes 7. The long turn, a brutal 24-hour shift that occurred when workers rotated between day and night schedules, was a regular feature of steel mill life, leaving men so exhausted that accidents became almost inevitable. The corporation kept detailed records of workplace injuries and deaths, and these records reveal a staggering toll of human suffering. In a single year, 1906, U.S. Steel's Southworks in Chicago recorded 46 deaths among a workforce of approximately 10,000 men. Across the entire corporation, hundreds of workers died annually, and thousands more were maimed, burned, or permanently disabled by the machinery and processes of steel production. The men who worked in the blast furnace departments faced perhaps the most extreme conditions. Blast furnaces operated continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing molten iron at temperatures exceeding 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The workers who tended these furnaces, what known as furnace men or keepers, worked in conditions of almost unbearable heat, their bodies constantly at risk from explosions, spills of molten metal, and the toxic gases that filled the air around the furnaces. A single misstep, a moment of inattention brought on by exhaustion, could result in death that was instantaneous and horrible. The corporation provided minimal safety equipment and even less training, and workers were expected to learn their jobs through observation and experience, often at the cost of injuries that served as brutal lessons. There was no workers' compensation system to support the families of killed or disabled workers, no pension program to provide for old age, and no job security to protect those who could no longer keep up with the relentless pace of production. If the ethnic composition of U.S. Steel's workforce reflected the great waves of immigration that were transforming American society in the early 20th century, by 1910, the majority of workers in the corporation's northern mills were immigrants from southern and eastern Europe: Poles, Slovaks, Hungarians, Croats, Serbs, Italians, Greeks, and Ukrainians who had come to America seeking opportunity and found instead the brutal reality of industrial labor. These immigrant workers were concentrated in the most dangerous and lowest paid positions, performing the heavy manual labor that native-born Americans increasingly refused to do. They lived in overcrowded boarding houses and tenements, often sharing beds in shifts that corresponded to the mill's work schedules. They faced discrimination not only from their employers, but from native-born workers and from a society that viewed them with suspicion and contempt. And yet they came by the hundreds of thousands, because even the harsh conditions of American steel mills offered more opportunity than the poverty and oppression they had left behind in Europe. In the South, U.S. Steel's workforce included a significant number of African American workers, particularly at the Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, which U.S. Steel acquired in 1907, under circumstances that would later provoke congressional investigation. Black workers in the Southern steel industry faced an additional layer of oppression beyond the dangers and demands that all steelworkers experienced. They were confined to the most dangerous and least skilled positions, paid less than white workers for the same labor, and subjected to the systematic humiliation of Jim Crow segregation that governed every aspect of Southern life. The company town of Fairfield, Alabama, built by U.S. Steel to house workers at its southern operations, was rigidly segregated by race, with black workers and their families confined to the least desirable areas and provided with inferior housing, schools, and services. The corporation did not create the racial hierarchy of the American South, but it profited from and perpetuated that hierarchy in ways that would have lasting consequences for generations. The resistance of U.S. Steel to organized labor was not merely a matter of corporate policy, but a fundamental element of the company's identity and operations. From its founding in 1901, the corporation was determined to maintain what it called the open shop, a euphemism for workplaces where unions were not recognized and workers had no collective bargaining rights. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, the union that had been crushed at Homestead in 1892, still existed in 1901, but its power had been dramatically reduced. U.S. Steel's leadership was determined to eliminate what remained of union influence and to prevent any new organizing efforts from gaining traction. The corporation employed an extensive network of labor spies who infiltrated worker communities, identified union sympathizers, and reported on any signs of organizing activity. Workers suspected of union involvement were immediately terminated and blacklisted, with their names shared among steel companies throughout the industry to ensure they would never work in steel again. The Great Steel Strike of 1919 represented the most significant challenge to U.S. Steel's anti-union policies in the corporation's first 2 decades. The strike was organized by the National Committee for Organizing Iron and Steel Workers, a coalition led by William Z. Foster, a radical labor organizer who would later become a leader of the American Communist Party. The workers' demands were modest by any reasonable standard: the right to organize and bargain collectively, an 8-hour workday to replace the 12-hour standard, and wage increases to compensate for wartime inflation that had eroded their purchasing power. More than 350,000 workers walked off the job in September of 1919, shutting down mills across the country and presenting U.S. Steel with the most serious threat to its authority since the Homestead strike nearly 3 decades earlier. The corporation's response was swift, brutal, and ultimately successful. U.S. Steel mobilized local police forces, state militias, and private security agencies to suppress the strike, using tactics that included mass arrests, violent dispersal of picket lines, and the deportation of immigrant workers under the pretext of wartime anti-radical legislation. In Gary, Indiana, martial law was declared, and federal troops occupied the city, their presence serving to intimidate workers and protect strikebreakers who were brought in to restart production. The corporation also waged a sophisticated propaganda campaign, portraying the strike as the work of foreign radicals and Bolshevik agitators rather than a legitimate expression of worker grievances. Newspapers controlled by or sympathetic to corporate interests published lurid stories about revolutionary conspiracies, playing on the anti-immigrant and anti-radical sentiments that pervaded American society in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. The strike collapsed in January of 1920, defeated by a combination of corporate resources, government intervention, public hostility, and internal divisions among the workers themselves. The 12-hour day continued. The open shop remained in place, and U.S. Steel emerged from the conflict more confident than ever in its ability to resist worker organization. It would take another decade and a half and the transformative labor legislation of the New Deal era before steelworkers would finally win the right to organize and bargain collectively. The Steelworkers Organizing Committee, which would later become the United Steelworkers of America, finally achieved recognition from U.S. Steel in 1937, following the passage of the National Labor Relations Act and a wave of sit-down strikes that swept through American industry. The victory came more than 40 years after the defeat at Homestead, and for the generations of workers who had labored and died in the intervening decades, it came too late. The environmental legacy of U.S. Steel's operations represents another dimension of the corporation's impact that was largely invisible to contemporaries, but would become devastatingly apparent to later generations. The production of steel is an inherently dirty process, generating vast quantities of air and water pollution as byproducts of the chemical and thermal transformations that convert iron ore into finished steel. In the early 20th century, there were virtually no regulations governing industrial pollution, and U.S. Steel and its competitors dumped their waste products into the air and water with abandon. The skies over Pittsburgh, Gary, Birmingham, and other steel centers were perpetually darkened by smoke and particulate matter that coated buildings, vegetation, and human lungs with a layer of industrial grime. The rivers that flowed past steel mills, the Monongahela, the Cuyahoga, the Calumet, became open sewers for industrial waste, their waters so contaminated that fish could not survive and human contact could cause illness. The workers who spent their lives inside the mills suffered the most direct consequences of this pollution. They breathed air thick with coal dust, coke oven emissions, and metallic particles that accumulated in their lungs over years and decades of exposure. Respiratory diseases, including silicosis, pneumoconiosis, and lung cancer, claimed thousands of steelworkers who had survived the more immediate dangers of accidents and injuries. The communities that surrounded the mills were likewise affected, their residents breathing the same polluted air and drinking water drawn from contaminated sources. Children growing up in steel towns experienced higher rates of asthma, developmental problems, and other health conditions that would not be fully understood or documented until decades later. The environmental costs of steel production were externalized onto workers, communities, and ecosystems that had no voice in corporate decision-making and no recourse against corporate harm. The corporation's approach to its host communities reflected a fundamental asymmetry of power that persisted throughout the 20th century. When a U.S. steel mill was profitable, the community benefited from employment, tax revenue, and the economic activity generated by thousands of workers and their families. But the corporation's commitment to these communities was entirely conditional on continued profitability. When markets shifted, when technology changed, when cheaper production became available elsewhere, U.S. Steel did not hesitate to close facilities, lay off workers, and abandon the towns that had been built around its operations. The company towns that had once represented total corporate control became ghost towns when the corporation decided to move on, their populations left stranded without employment, without economic prospects, and without the resources to rebuild their communities on different foundations. The decline of the American steel industry began in earnest in the 1960s and accelerated dramatically in the 1970s and 80s, transforming the industrial heartland into what came to be known as the Rust Belt. U.S. Steel, despite its massive size and decades of dominance, proved unable to adapt to changing global conditions. The corporation had grown complacent during its years of market control, underinvesting in new technology and new facilities while foreign competitors, particularly in Japan and later Korea, built modern mills using the latest production techniques. The basic oxygen furnace, which could produce steel faster and more efficiently than the open hearth furnaces that U.S. Steel still relied upon, was adopted slowly and reluctantly. Continuous casting technology, which eliminated entire steps in the production process, was likewise resisted by a corporate culture that valued tradition over innovation. The oil shock of 1973 and the recessions that followed exposed the vulnerability of the American steel industry to foreign competition, Japanese steel, and produced in state-of-the-art facilities by a workforce that was more productive and lower paid than American workers, flooded into the United States market at prices that domestic producers could not match. U.S. Steel's market share, which had been approximately 70% at the company's founding, had already declined to roughly 25% by the 1960s. By the 1980s, it was clear that the corporation would never regain its former dominance. Mills that had operated continuously for decades began to close. Blast furnaces that had been the pride of American industry were shut down and left to rust. Workers who had expected lifetime employment found themselves on unemployment lines, their skills suddenly worthless in an economy that was moving away from heavy manufacturing. The human cost of deindustrialization fell most heavily on the communities that had been built around steel production. Gary, Indiana, the city that U.S. Steel had created from nothing, became a national symbol of urban decay and economic collapse. The population, which had peaked at approximately 178,000 in 1960, plummeted as workers left in search of employment elsewhere. Those who remained faced rising poverty, deteriorating infrastructure, and social problems that multiplied in the absence of economic opportunity. The beautiful civic buildings that the corporation had constructed in the early 20th century fell into disrepair. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned, their houses left vacant and eventually demolished. The Gary Works, once the largest integrated steel mill in the world, shrank to a fraction of its former size, its workforce reduced from tens of thousands to just a few thousand. Similar patterns repeated themselves across the steel belt. Homestead, Pennsylvania, the site of the infamous 1892 strike, saw its population decline from nearly 20,000 in 1950 to barely 3,000 by 2010. Youngstown, Ohio, experienced what became known as Black Monday when the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company closed its Campbell Works in 1977, eliminating 5,000 jobs in a single day. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, once home to Bethlehem Steel, the second largest American steel producer, watched its mills close and its economy collapse over the course of the 1980s and 90s. The communities that had been forged by steel were broken by its departure, and the chains that had once bound workers to dangerous and demanding labor were replaced by the chains of poverty, unemployment, and diminished opportunity. In 1986, United States Steel Corporation officially changed its name to USX Corporation, signaling a strategic shift away from steel production and toward energy, particularly oil and gas. The corporation had acquired Marathon Oil in 1982, and by the mid-80s, energy operations were generating more profit than steel. The name change was an acknowledgement that steel was no longer the core of the enterprise, that the industry which had made the corporation the largest in the world was now a declining business to be managed for cash rather than growth. The symbolism was unmistakable. The company that had once embodied American industrial might was retreating from manufacturing altogether, following the path of so many other corporations that found it easier to extract resources or manipulate financial assets than to actually make things. The transformation of U.S. Steel into USX and its subsequent evolution through spin-offs, mergers, and restructurings represents the final chapter in the story of America's first billion-dollar corporation. The steel operations that remained were eventually separated into a standalone company that reclaimed the U.S. Steel name in 2001, exactly 1 century after J.P. Morgan's original creation. This new U.S. Steel was a shadow of its former self, employing approximately 22,000 workers compared to the hundreds of thousands who had labored in the mills at the corporation's peak. It faced continued competition from foreign producers, struggled with legacy costs, including pensions and healthcare obligations to retired workers, and operated in an industry that had been fundamentally transformed by globalization and technological change. And yet, the legacy of U.S. Steel extends far beyond the corporation's balance sheet or stock price. The steel that poured from U.S. Steel's furnaces built the skyscrapers that define the American urban skyline, from the Empire State Building to the Sears Tower. It built the bridges that spanned American rivers, from the Golden Gate to the Verrazano Narrows. It built the railroads that connected American cities and the ships that carried American goods across the oceans. It built the weapons that armed American soldiers in 2 world wars and countless smaller conflicts. The physical infrastructure of 20th century America was forged in U.S. Steel's mills, and that infrastructure continues to shape American life long after the mills themselves have fallen silent. But the legacy of U.S. Steel also includes the darker elements that we have traced throughout this documentary. It includes the workers who died in preventable accidents because safety cost money that could otherwise be profit. It includes the labor organizers who were beaten, blacklisted, and sometimes killed for demanding basic human dignity. It includes the communities that were built to serve corporate needs and abandoned when those needs changed. It includes the rivers that were poisoned, the air that was fouled, and the landscapes that were scarred by extraction and production. It includes the racial hierarchies that were reinforced by corporate policies and the immigrant workers who were exploited and discarded. The chains that bound American workers to American steel were real chains, forged not from metal, but from economic necessity, corporate power, and governmental complicity. The story of U.S. Steel is, in the end, a story about the nature of industrial capitalism itself, about the immense creative power and the equally immense destructive capacity of the modern corporation. J.P. Morgan created something unprecedented when he assembled U.S. Steel in 1901, an organization of such scale and power that it could shape not only markets, but entire communities, not only prices, but the very fabric of American society. The corporation delivered extraordinary value to its shareholders and executives, making Morgan, Carnegie, Gary, and others wealthy beyond imagination. But it extracted that value from workers who had little choice but to accept the terms offered to them, from communities that had little power to resist corporate demands, and from an environment that had no voice at all in the decisions that affected it. The lessons of U.S. Steel's history remain urgently relevant in our own time, as we grapple with new forms of corporate power that have emerged in the digital age. The technology giants of the 21st century exercise a degree of control over information, communication, and commerce that rivals the control U.S. Steel once exercised over steel. They build company towns, not from brick and mortar, but from code and data, creating digital environments where users live and work under terms set entirely by corporate policy. They resist regulation with the same determination that U.S. Steel once resisted labor organizing, arguing that government interference would destroy innovation and harm consumers. And they concentrate wealth at the very top while the workers who power their platforms struggle with insecurity and insufficient compensation. As we conclude this journey through the dark history of America's first billion-dollar corporation, we are left with questions that admit no easy answers. How do we balance the productive power of large corporations against the dangers of concentrated economic power? How do we protect workers and communities from the costs of industrial change, while still permitting the creative destruction that drives economic progress? How do we ensure that the benefits of corporate activity are shared broadly rather than captured by a privileged few? These questions were raised by the creation of U.S. Steel more than a century ago, and they remain unresolved in our own time. The blast furnaces of Gary, Indiana, most of them cold now, stand as monuments to an industrial age that has passed but whose consequences continue to shape American life. The descendants of the immigrant workers who poured into the mills in the early 20th century still live in communities marked by the industry's rise and fall. The environmental damage inflicted by decades of unregulated production continues to affect the health of people who live near former mill sites. The economic devastation of deindustrialization continues to fuel the political grievances of regions that feel abandoned by the coastal elites and global corporations that have benefited from economic change. The chains that U.S. Steel forged may have rusted, but they have not disappeared. The story of U.S. Steel is ultimately a cautionary tale about what happens when private power exceeds public accountability, when the pursuit of profit is allowed to override all other values, and when those who bear the costs of economic activity are excluded from the decisions that affect their lives. It is a story that should make us skeptical of corporate promises and attentive to corporate actions. It is a story that should remind us that progress is never free, that someone always pays the price, and that the distribution of those costs is a matter of power rather than necessity. And it is a story that should inspire us to demand better treatment of workers, better stewardship of communities, better protection of the environment, and better accountability from the corporations that shape our world. J.P. Morgan's handshake in 1901 created an industrial empire that lasted a century. The communities, workers, and landscapes that empire consumed will bear its mark for centuries more. The forged industrial chains may have loosened, but they have never been fully broken. And until we reckon honestly with that history, until we understand the true costs of industrial progress and demand that those costs be shared fairly, we will remain bound by the patterns established when American steel was king, and the men who controlled it believed themselves accountable to no one but themselves. This has been Coded Dark Wealth. Thank you for watching.